Montana Territory, 1878. When the first snows of winter came early to the frontier, so did loneliness. Harlan O'Connor knew this better than most as he rode his paint horse through the growing drifts, a solitary figure against the vast white wilderness. At 25, he'd spent enough seasons on the range to learn that the frontier offered no room for tender feelings. Only survival, hard work, and if a man was lucky, enough money to make it to spring. The wind cut across the mountain pass like a knife, and Harlan pulled his sheepskin coat tighter. His handsome features, weathered but youthful beneath his wide-brimmed hat, betrayed little emotion. In the 5 years since he'd left his family's failed farm in Missouri to seek fortune in the West, he'd built a reputation as a capable ranch hand who kept to himself. The stubble on his strong jawline was the only concession he made to the days spent alone on the trail. A man's a fool to count on anything but his own 2 hands and a good horse in this country, he muttered to his mount as they pushed through deepening snow. Nearby ranchers respected Harlan for his skill with horses and cattle, but few knew him beyond that. He preferred it that way. Everyone he'd ever let close had either died or betrayed him. His mother to fever, his father to drink, and the girl back home to a banker's son while Harlan was working his first cattle drive. The Montana wilderness had taught Harlan that attachment was weakness. In a land where each winter claimed lives and each summer burned away dreams, a man survived by keeping his guard up and his expectations low. He was 3 days into a journey back to the Rockingham Ranch where he worked, returning from delivering a prized bull to a ranch 50 miles north. The trail would have been simple in summer, but the early blizzard had changed everything. Now, as darkness approached on the second day of the storm, Harlan searched the hillside for any shelter that might offer protection for the night. That's when he saw it, a shape against the white, barely visible through the thickening snowfall. At first, he thought it might be a fallen tree or perhaps a deer. But as he drew closer, his heart quickened. It was a human figure half buried in snow beside an overturned carriage, the horses nowhere to be seen. "Hello," he called, dismounting quickly and trudging through knee-deep drifts. "Can you hear me?" The figure didn't stir. Reaching the carriage, Harlan found a young woman slumped against the broken vehicle, her traveling cloak pulled tight around her slender form. Snow had already accumulated on her shoulders and the wide-brimmed bonnet that partially obscured her face. "Miss?" Harlan knelt beside her, brushing away the snow. When he lifted her chin gently, he found himself looking at the face of a woman no older than 22, her lips blue with cold but her features striking even in their pallor. Her chestnut brown hair, escaping from beneath her bonnet, framed a face too refined for frontier life. To his relief, she stirred at his touch, her eyelids fluttering open to reveal deep blue eyes clouded with confusion. "The horses," she murmured. "Spooked by the storm. They ran." "Don't talk now," Harlan said, his practiced detachment wavering as he assessed her condition. "How long have you been out here?" "Hours, perhaps. I tried to walk, but—" She gestured weakly at her ankle, visibly swollen even beneath her sodden skirts. Harlan knew without calculation that she wouldn't last another hour in this cold. The nearest town was 20 miles away, the ranch where he worked even further. There was only one option. "I've got a shelter," he said, remembering the old trapper's cabin he'd spotted on his journey north. "It's about a mile back. Can you hold on if I carry you?" The woman nodded weakly, and Harlan lifted her into his arms, surprised by how light she felt despite her elaborate traveling clothes. A quality wool dress beneath her cloak, with fine stitching no frontier seamstress could match. "My name is Harlan O'Connor," he said, placing her carefully on his horse before mounting behind her. "I work at the Rockingham." "Penelope," she managed through chattering teeth, leaning back against his chest as he wrapped his coat around them both. "Penelope Caldwell." "Hold tight, Miss Caldwell," Harlan said, turning his horse toward shelter. "I promise you won't freeze today." He couldn't have known that this simple act of mercy would change everything he believed about survival in the West. And he certainly couldn't have known who Penelope Caldwell really was. The abandoned trapper's cabin was little more than a single room with a stone fireplace, but to Harlan and Penelope, it might as well have been a palace. After breaking the lock with the butt of his revolver, Harlan carried Penelope inside and laid her gently on the crude wooden platform that served as a bed. "Stay with me, Miss Caldwell," he urged as he rushed to build a fire with the remaining logs stacked beside the hearth. His fingers worked quickly, striking flint to steel until sparks caught the dry kindling he'd pulled from his saddlebags. As warmth slowly returned to the cabin, Harlan turned his attention back to Penelope. Her breathing was shallow, her skin frighteningly cold to the touch. 5 years on the frontier had taught him enough about survival to recognize the danger she was in. "Miss Caldwell, your clothes are soaked through. You need to get warm." He hesitated, propriety warring with practical necessity. "I have a dry blanket in my pack, but—" Her eyes opened, clearer now but filled with fear. "I understand," she whispered. "Please, I don't want to die out here." Turning his back to give her privacy, Harlan handed her his spare shirt and woolen blanket. "Change into this. I'll tend to the fire." He listened to the soft rustling of fabric, focusing intently on building up the flames until she spoke again. "I'm decent now, Mr. O'Connor." When he turned, she was wrapped in his blanket, her wet clothes spread near the fire. Her chestnut hair fell in damp waves around her shoulders, and color had begun returning to her cheeks. Even in his rough cotton shirt, which hung like a dress on her slender frame, she possessed a dignity that seemed out of place in the crude cabin. "Where were you headed, Miss Caldwell?" Harlan asked as he prepared coffee from his supplies, more to keep her talking and alert than from curiosity. "Helena," she replied, watching him with those striking blue eyes. "I was supposed to arrive yesterday. My driver thought we could outrun the storm." A shadow crossed her face. "Do you think he survived?" Harlan considered lying, but decided against it. If he had sense enough to follow the horses, maybe. They'd head downslope, out of the wind. She nodded, accepting his assessment with surprising composure. "And you? What brings a rancher so far from home in weather like this?" Delivering a bowl to the Patterson spread, Harlan answered, handing her a tin cup of black coffee. "Hold this between your hands. The warmth will help." As she sipped the bitter liquid, Harlan checked her ankle, which had swollen considerably. With gentle hands that belied his usual gruffness, he wrapped it with a strip of cloth. "It's not broken," he said, "but you won't be walking far for a few days." "A few days?" Panic flashed across her face. "But I have to reach Helena. It's imperative that I—" She stopped herself, taking a deep breath. "People will be worried." Harlan shrugged. "Storm like this, no one's traveling anywhere. We're lucky to have shelter." He glanced out the single grimy window at the whirling snow. 2, maybe 3 days before the trails are passable again. Penelope clutched the blanket tighter. "You don't understand. My father—" Again, she cut herself off. "Your father can wait," Harlan said firmly. "Unless you'd prefer to freeze to death trying to reach him." For a moment, it seemed she might argue, but then her shoulders slumped slightly. "You're right, of course. Forgive me. I'm not accustomed to situations like this." That much was obvious. Everything about her, from her cultivated speech to her fine clothes now drying by the fire, spoke of city life and privilege. Harlan had met few women like her in his years on the frontier, and those he had encountered had usually been passing through, their faces filled with either fear or contempt for the wild country. Yet there was something different about Penelope Caldwell. Behind her obvious refinement lay a steadiness that intrigued him. "Why Helena?" he asked, preparing a simple meal from his provisions. Not many young ladies travel alone to territorial capitals in winter. A guarded expression crossed her face. "Family matters," she said simply. Harlan nodded, respecting her privacy even as his curiosity deepened. They ate in companionable silence, jerky, hardtack, and coffee, until Penelope spoke again. "You saved my life today, Mr. O'Connor. I won't forget that." "Anyone would have done the same," he replied automatically. "No," she said with surprising certainty. "Not everyone would have. I've learned that much about people." Something in her tone caught his attention, a hint of past disappointment that felt oddly familiar. For the first time in years, Harlan felt a flicker of recognition, of understanding another person's private pain. "Get some rest, Miss Caldwell," he said, more gently than he'd spoken to anyone in a long while. "Tomorrow we'll see what the storm decides to do with us." As night deepened and the cabin creaked under the weight of accumulating snow, Harlan made his bed on the floor near the fire, leaving the crude platform for Penelope. Sleep came slowly as he found himself uncomfortably aware of her presence just a few feet away, not merely as a woman, but as a human connection he hadn't planned or prepared for. His last thought before drifting off was a troubling one. In saving her from freezing, he might have endangered something in himself that had stayed safely frozen for years. The blizzard raged for 2 more days, trapping them in the cabin together. At first, conversation came reluctantly, limited to practicalities, tending the fire, conserving supplies, checking Penelope's injured ankle. But as hours stretched into days, the silence between them gradually filled with words neither had intended to share. Harlan found himself telling her about his family's failed farm, the bitter departure from home at 20, the hard lessons of the trail. Penelope listened with an attentiveness he hadn't experienced from another person in years. "You speak as if the frontier has nothing to offer but hardship," she observed on the second evening as they shared the last of his coffee. "Yet you've stayed." Harlan poked at the fire, watching sparks rise up the chimney. "A man knows where he stands out here. No pretense, no false promises. The land either kills you or it doesn't." "That sounds terribly lonely," Penelope said quietly. "Lonely is safer than disappointed," he replied, the words emerging before he could stop them. She studied him in the flickering light, her blue eyes thoughtful. "Who disappointed you so thoroughly that you'd choose isolation over connection, Mr. O'Connor?" The directness of her question startled him. Most women he'd encountered on the frontier were either hardened by their own struggles or too genteel to speak so plainly. "Everyone, eventually," he answered honestly. "My father chose the bottle over his family. My mother worked herself to death trying to save a farm that was doomed from the start. And Elizabeth," he stopped, surprised to find himself speaking a name he hadn't uttered in years. "Elizabeth?" Penelope prompted gently. Harlan shrugged, trying to reclaim his customary detachment. "A girl back home. She promised to wait while I earned enough to buy our own place. Found herself a banker's son instead." He gave a harsh laugh. "Can't blame her. Bank vault offers more security than a cowhand's promise." "I'm sorry," Penelope said, and something in her tone made him believe she truly was. "Though perhaps she did you a favor in her way. Better to learn someone's true nature before building a life with them." There was a weight to her words that suggested personal experience, and Harlan found himself curious despite his better judgment. "You sound like you speak from knowledge, Miss Caldwell." Penelope gazed into the fire, her profile softened by the golden light. "I was engaged once, to a man my father approved of, the son of a business associate. Everything arranged very properly." Her mouth tightened slightly. "Until I discovered he viewed me primarily as a convenient connection to my father's influence." "Your father must be an important man," Harlan observed. A shadow crossed her face. "He is, though perhaps not in ways that truly matter." She looked up suddenly. "Have you ever noticed how people change when they discover who your family is? As if your name matters more than your character?" Harlan considered this. "Can't say I have. O'Connor doesn't open many doors out here." She smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face. "No, I don't imagine it would. There's a certain freedom in that, isn't there?" "Freedom has different meanings to different folks," Harlan replied. "Out here, it mostly means no one to rely on but yourself." "And is that truly freedom?" she challenged, leaning forward slightly. "Or just another kind of prison?" The question lingered between them, unanswered but unsettling. For the first time in years, Harlan found himself questioning the walls he'd built around his life. On the morning of the 4th day, the storm finally broke, revealing a transformed landscape glittering under a brilliant blue sky. Harlan stepped outside to check his horse and assess the trails, returning to find Penelope attempting to stand. "Whoa there," he said, rushing to her side when she winced in pain. "That ankle needs more rest." "We can't stay here indefinitely," she insisted, though she accepted his support. "I've already delayed important matters too long." Harlan helped her back to the bed. "The main trail should be passable by tomorrow. I can get you to Helena then." Relief crossed her face, followed quickly by what looked strangely like regret. "Thank you. I don't know how to repay your kindness." "No repayment necessary," Harlan said automatically, though a part of him recognized that something had shifted during their days together, something he wasn't quite ready to acknowledge. As he packed their few belongings and prepared for the journey ahead, Penelope watched him with those perceptive blue eyes. "Will you return directly to your ranch after Helena?" she asked. "That's the plan," he replied, not meeting her gaze. "Winter work waiting." "Perhaps," she began, then stopped herself. "Never mind. It's not important." but something in her voice made him look up. What is it? Penelope smoothed the blanket with slender fingers. I was only thinking that if you ever come to Helena again, you might call on me, so I could properly thank you. The invitation hung in the air between them, weighted with possibilities neither had anticipated when the storm brought them together. Harlan found himself unable to dismiss it with his usual practiced indifference. I might at that, he said finally, surprising himself as much as her. The journey to Helena took most of the following day, with Penelope riding before him on his horse. As they traveled, Harlan became increasingly aware of the changes their forced companionship had wrought. Conversation came easily now, punctuated by comfortable silences that felt nothing like the isolation he'd grown accustomed to. When the territorial capital came into view, a growing city nestled in a mountain valley, Penelope tensed slightly in the saddle. Where should I take you? Harlan asked, realizing he knew nothing of her actual circumstances in Helena. She hesitated. The governor's mansion, please. Harlan frowned, certain he'd misheard. The governor's mansion? You have business there. Penelope turned slightly, meeting his questioning look with a mixture of resignation and defiance. In a manner of speaking, my father is Governor Edward Caldwell. The revelation struck Harlan like a physical blow. Governor Caldwell was the most powerful man in the territory, a former general and Eastern businessman who'd been appointed by the president himself. And Harlan had been sharing jerky and coffee with the man's daughter for 4 days, while she wore his spare shirt and slept on a trapper's crude bed. You're the governor's daughter, he repeated, his voice flat with disbelief. I am a person first, she said firmly. The same person you've spoken with these past days. But Harlan had already retreated behind the walls that had protected him for years. Of course, Miss Caldwell. My apologies for the circumstances of our acquaintance. Her eyes flashed with hurt and something like anger. Don't do that. Don't suddenly treat me as if I'm a stranger because you know my father's title. It's not about his title, Harlan said stiffly. It's about knowing where things stand. A cowhand and a governor's daughter don't inhabit the same world, Miss Caldwell. That's just how it is. That's how you choose to see it, she countered. I thought you of all people would understand that titles and positions are just trappings, not the measure of a person. They rode the rest of the way in tense silence, the easy companionship of days past evaporating in the cold reality of Helena's approaching streets. As they neared the governor's residence, an imposing structure befitting the territory's highest official, activity erupted around them. A man shouted, several uniformed figures rushed forward, and suddenly they were surrounded by territorial militiamen. Miss Caldwell, a stern-faced officer approached. Thank God. The governor has men searching half the territory for you. Harlan helped Penelope dismount, acutely aware of the suspicious glances directed his way. A rough-looking cowboy with several days' growth of beard, bringing in the governor's missing daughter. Captain Reynolds. Penelope acknowledged the officer with composed dignity despite her trail-worn appearance. This is Mr. Harlan O'Connor. He saved my life when our carriage overturned in the blizzard. Please ensure he receives every courtesy. Before the captain could respond, the mansion's doors flew open, and a distinguished-looking man with silver hair and a military bearing strode out. Penelope, Governor Caldwell's authoritative voice carried across the yard. Where in God's name have you been? The entire territory is in uproar. As her father approached, Harlan noticed Penelope straightening despite her injured ankle, her chin lifting in a way that suggested this was a familiar confrontation. Father, she greeted him formally. My carriage overturned in the storm. If not for Mr. O'Connor's intervention, I would have frozen to death. The governor turned his penetrating gaze on Harlan, assessing him with the practiced eye of a man accustomed to judging others quickly. You have my gratitude, young man, he said after a moment, though his tone suggested he was reserving judgment. Captain, see that Mr. O'Connor is compensated for his trouble. It wasn't trouble, sir, Harlan said, meeting the older man's gaze steadily. Anyone would have done the same. Nevertheless, the governor replied dismissively, already turning his attention back to his daughter. Penelope, you're injured. And dressed like. Good heavens, we must get you inside immediately. The Williamson Ball is tonight, and half of territorial society will be attending. What were you thinking, traveling in such weather? I was thinking I would arrive in time for your birthday as promised, Penelope replied with a hint of frost. The weather had other ideas. As servants rushed forward to assist Penelope, she turned toward Harlan, something unspoken in her eyes. "Mr. O'Connor, I hope you'll—" "Penelope, inside now," her father interrupted. "Dr. Kensington is waiting, and there's much to prepare. Captain Reynolds will handle matters here." Harlan watched as Penelope was led away, her last glance over her shoulder filled with things unsaid. In that moment, he felt the familiar cold certainty settling back around his heart. The brief connection they'd shared belonged to the storm and the isolated cabin, not to this world of mansions and militiamen, governors, and society balls. Captain Reynolds cleared his throat. "If you'll follow me, Mr. O'Connor, I'll see to your compensation." "No need," Harlan said, already turning his horse. "I was just doing what needed doing." "The governor insists," the captain pressed. "The governor doesn't know me," Harlan replied, touching the brim of his hat in farewell. "Good day, Captain." As he rode away from the governor's mansion, Harlan told himself he was simply returning to reality, to the life he'd chosen, where expectations remained low and disappointments fewer. Yet the walls that had once felt like protection now seemed strangely like constraints. For the first time in years, Harlan O'Connor rode away from Helena feeling not the relief of escaped connection, but the hollow ache of something valuable left behind. 3 weeks later, the Rockingham Ranch stood frozen under January's grip. Harlan had returned to find the expected winter work waiting. Mending tack, breaking stubborn horses for spring roundup, ensuring cattle survived the harshest months. He threw himself into these tasks with singular focus, speaking little and sleeping less. If the other hands noticed the change in him, a new restlessness beneath his usual stoic manner, they knew better than to mention it. Harlan O'Connor had always kept his own counsel, and the frontier respected a man's right to his private thoughts. But on this particular evening, as Harlan finished his chores and headed toward the bunkhouse, the ranch owner's wife called to him from the main house porch. "Harlan, letter came for you on yesterday's stage." Mrs. Miller waved an envelope. "From Helena, looks like. Didn't know you had connections in the capital." "Neither did I," Harlan muttered, taking the envelope with a nod of thanks. In the privacy of the barn, he examined the fine stationery, the elegant handwriting that spelled out his name. For a long moment, he considered simply burning it, preserving the certainty of his solitary life rather than reopening a door better left closed. Yet something, perhaps the same instinct that had led him to search for shelter in a blizzard rather than surrendering to nature's harshness, made him break the seal instead. Mr. O'Connor, I trust this letter finds you well and safely returned to your ranch. My ankle has healed completely, thanks in no small part to your timely rescue and care. I find myself troubled by our parting in Helena. There was much left unsaid, and I cannot help but feel you departed with a misunderstanding of both my circumstances and my character. My father, for all his position and influence, does not dictate my heart or my choices. If our days together in that humble cabin taught me anything, it was the value of seeing a person clearly, without the distortions of title or expectation. I believed you saw me thus, not as a governor's daughter, but simply as Penelope. Was I mistaken? The territorial legislature convenes next month, bringing ranchers and representatives from across Montana to Helena. Should your work permit travel during this time, I would welcome the opportunity to demonstrate that the connection we formed was neither imagined nor impossible to reclaim. Whatever you decide, please know that 4 days in a storm-bound cabin with Harlan O'Connor taught me more about courage and genuine character than a lifetime in society's drawing rooms. With sincere regard. Penelope Caldwell P.S. I have enclosed a token you may recognize. Harlan turned the envelope and a small object fell into his palm. A carved wooden horse, crude but recognizable, that he had whittled during their last evening in the cabin and given to her as a simple parting gift. He had almost forgotten the gesture, made in a rare moment of unguarded sentiment. That she had kept it and now returned it as a reminder struck him with unexpected force. For nearly an hour, Harlan sat on a hay bale in the cold barn, reading and rereading the letter as darkness gathered outside. The neat handwriting seemed to carry her voice, challenging the beliefs he'd held so firmly about the impossibility of bridging different worlds. When he finally rose, his decision was made not in words but in action, walking directly to the ranch house to request time off for the legislative session. Legislative politics, O'Connor? Mr. Miller had asked with raised eyebrows. Never figured you for the type. Reckon there's a lot about me nobody's figured yet, Harlan had replied, surprising himself with the truth of the statement. 2 weeks later, Harlan rode into Helena wearing his one good shirt and the new coat he'd purchased with carefully hoarded wages. The city had grown since his brief visit after the storm, its streets bustling with the activity that accompanied the territorial legislature's gathering. He stabled his horse at a modest livery and inquired about accommodations, securing a room at a boarding house that catered to visitors of limited means. After washing away the trail dust and trimming his stubble to respectability, Harlan faced his most daunting challenge, presenting himself at the governor's mansion not as a rescuer, but as a caller. The same uniformed militiaman who had greeted them weeks before stood guard at the entrance. His expression registered surprise and then suspicion as Harlan approached. "Help you, mister?" he asked, hand resting casually near his sidearm. "Harlan O'Connor to see Miss Caldwell," Harlan said, removing his hat. "She's expecting me." The guard's eyebrows rose. "Is she now?" "Wait here." Minutes passed in uncomfortable scrutiny before the guard returned with a house servant who led Harlan not to the main entrance, but to a side garden gate. "Miss Caldwell requests you join her in the conservatory," the servant explained, conducting him through a glass-enclosed garden space filled with plants that defied Montana's winter outside. And there she was, among blooming flowers that had no business thriving in January, looking nothing like the trail-worn woman he'd rescued, and everything like the governor's daughter she was. Her chestnut hair was arranged elegantly, her blue dress clearly fashioned by skilled hands. Yet when she turned at his entrance, the smile that lit her face was exactly the same one that had warmed the trapper's cabin. "Mr. O'Connor," she said, extending her hands in greeting. "You came." Harlan took her hands, finding them warm and surprisingly strong in his grasp. "Your letter was persuasive. I feared I might never see you again," Penelope admitted, leading him to a wrought iron bench among the greenery. "After you left so abruptly." "I'm not accustomed to governor's mansions," Harlan said honestly, "or to being the rough rescue party when finely dressed officials are standing by." Penelope's blue eyes studied him with the same directness he remembered. "You're not accustomed to believing you belong in certain circles. That's quite different." The observation, so accurate and plainly stated, broke through Harlan's carefully maintained reserve. "Miss Caldwell." "Penelope," she corrected. "After sharing coffee and jerky for 4 days, I think we're beyond formalities." "Penelope," he conceded, the name feeling both foreign and familiar on his tongue. "I'm a ranch hand with dirt under my nails and not much to my name." "You're a woman," she finished for him, "who spent 4 days seeing the true character of a man when all pretense was stripped away by circumstance." She leaned forward slightly. "Do you know how rare that is? To truly know someone, beyond the masks we all wear." Harlan looked around at the lush conservatory, so at odds with the winter wasteland outside. "This is your world," he said quietly. "That cabin was just a temporary shelter." "Worlds change," Penelope replied with surprising conviction. "And sometimes, Mr. O'Connor, a temporary shelter reveals more truth than a permanent mansion." Before Harlan could respond, the conservatory door opened, and Governor Caldwell entered, his authoritative presence immediately filling the space. His eyes narrowed slightly at the sight of Harlan sitting beside his daughter. "Ah, the cowboy rescuer returns," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "I don't believe I properly thanked you for my daughter's safe return, Mr. O'Connor." Harlan stood, meeting the older man's evaluating gaze. "No thanks necessary, Governor." "Father," Penelope said, rising beside Harlan. "Mr. O'Connor has come to Helena for the legislative session. I've invited him to attend the reception tomorrow evening." The governor's eyebrows rose fractionally. "Have you indeed? Well, Mr. O'Connor, do you have business with the legislature?" "Water rights concerns from ranchers in my region," Harlan replied smoothly, drawing on conversations he'd overheard at the Rocking M. "Mr. Miller thought someone should represent our interests." It wasn't entirely a lie. Miller had mentioned the issue, though he'd never suggested Harlan as a representative. The governor seemed to accept the explanation nonetheless, though his expression remained guarded. Very well. We welcome all territorial interests at the reception. He turned to his daughter. Penelope, Senator Harrison and his wife have arrived for tea. They're waiting in the parlor. The dismissal was clear, but Penelope stood her ground with practiced grace. Please extend my apologies, Father. I'll join them shortly. I need a few more moments with Mr. O'Connor. A brief battle of wills passed silently between father and daughter before the governor inclined his head slightly. Don't be long. The Harrisons have traveled far. With a last measuring look at Harlan, he withdrew. Once they were alone again, Penelope sighed. My father believes his position grants him authority over not just the territory, but everyone in his orbit. He's protective, Harlan observed. Can't fault a father for that. There's protection and there's control, Penelope replied, a hint of steel beneath her composed exterior. I've spent my life distinguishing between the two. She reached for a small card on a nearby table. The reception begins at 8 tomorrow evening. Ask for me when you arrive. Her fingers brushed his as she handed him the invitation. Promise you'll come? No matter how many reasons you think of to stay away. The touch of her hand and the earnestness in her blue eyes dissolved Harlan's carefully constructed objections. I'll be there, he promised. As a servant escorted him back through the garden gate, Harlan wondered if he'd just made the wisest decision or the most foolish one of his life. The frontier had taught him to survive by keeping his distance from hopes too fragile for harsh realities. Yet something about Penelope Caldwell made him question whether survival alone was enough. The territorial reception transformed the governor's mansion into a showcase of Montana's emerging society. Lamps blazed in every window, carriages lined the circular drive, and the sound of an orchestral ensemble drifted into the winter night. Harlan, dressed in his best, which still marked him clearly as a working man among politicians and businessmen, approached the entrance with a determination born of his promise to Penelope rather than any comfort with the proceedings. The receiving line moved slowly, giving him ample time to question his presence among Helena's elite. When he finally reached the grand entrance hall, Governor Caldwell was greeting guests with practiced political charm that froze momentarily upon recognizing Harlan. Mr. O'Connor, he acknowledged, his handshake firm, but his smile not reaching his eyes. I understand you've become quite interested in territorial politics. Just learning my way, Governor, Harlan replied evenly. Indeed. You'll find many educational conversations tonight. The governor gestured toward the crowded ballroom. Do enjoy yourself. The dismissal was clear, but as Harlan moved to pass, Caldwell added quietly, My daughter has a certain fondness for rescue cases. I would hate to see anyone mistake her natural compassion for something more significant. Before Harlan could respond to the thinly veiled warning, the governor had already turned to the next guest. Swallowing his pride and rising anger, Harlan entered the ballroom, immediately feeling as conspicuous as a wolf among sheep. He had almost decided to leave when he saw her across the room. Penelope stood among a cluster of territorial officials, her golden evening gown catching the light from crystal chandeliers. Unlike the other society women who smiled vacantly beside their husbands, she was actively engaged in what appeared to be a spirited discussion with a senator twice her age. As if sensing his presence, she looked up, her face brightening upon seeing him. With a graceful excusal to her companions, she made her way directly to him, navigating the crowded floor with practiced ease. You came, she said, genuine pleasure in her voice. I feared you might not. I gave my word, Harlan replied simply. Penelope took his arm, ignoring the curious glances from nearby guests. Come, let me introduce you to people who actually matter in territorial affairs, rather than those who merely think they do. For the next hour, Harlan found himself guided through the intricate social landscape of territorial politics. To his surprise, Penelope introduced him not as her rescuer, but as a representative of ranching interests, creating space for him to speak on water rights issues he understood from practical experience. More surprising still was discovering that his straightforward perspective earned the respect of several legislators tired of political maneuvering. You have quite a talent for this, Penelope observed as they paused near the refreshment table. Direct speech is refreshing among so much careful posturing. Just speaking plain, Harlan said, uncomfortable with her praise. Not much use for fancy talk on the range. Which is precisely why they listen, she replied. Half these men have never seen the territories they legislate beyond the view from a train window. A slow waltz began, and Penelope turned to him with expectation in her eyes. Do you dance, Mr. O'Connor? Not like this, he admitted. Barn dances are more my experience. The steps are simple enough, she said, her hand still resting on his arm. I could show you. The invitation hung between them, weighted with meaning beyond a simple dance. Before Harlan could respond, a cultured voice interrupted. Penelope, darling, your father is looking for you. The ambassador needs proper introduction. A handsome man in his 30s, impeccably dressed and radiating confidence, laid a proprietary hand on Penelope's shoulder. I'll escort you. Thank you, Richard, but I'm currently engaged with Mr. O'Connor. Penelope replied, her tone cooling noticeably. Richard turned assessing eyes on Harlan, taking in his weathered face and serviceable but plain attire. Ah, the cowboy rescuer. We've all heard the dramatic tale. He extended a manicured hand. Richard Thornton, my father and the governor have business interests together. Harlan shook the offered hand, immediately recognizing the type. Wealthy, entitled, and accustomed to deference. Harlan O'Connor. Charmed, Thornton said insincerely. Now, Penelope, your father was quite insistent. Then my father can come find me himself, she replied with steel beneath her polite smile. Mr. O'Connor and I were about to dance. Thornton's expression hardened slightly. I don't think that's appropriate. Given what, Richard? Penelope challenged, her blue eyes flashing. A tense silence followed before Thornton offered a tight smile. Given that your father specifically requested your presence, of course. But by all means, enjoy your novelty. With a curt nod to Harlan, he withdrew. I apologize for Richard, Penelope said once he was out of earshot. He believes my father has promised him my hand, despite my repeated refusals. Has he? Harlan asked quietly. Promised you to him? Penelope's chin lifted. My father may govern the territory, but he does not govern my heart. She held out her hand. Now, about that dance. Taking her hand felt like crossing a boundary Harlan had never intended to approach. As they moved onto the dance floor, he was acutely aware of the eyes following them, the governor's daughter and the unknown cowhand, stepping outside the careful social hierarchies that govern territorial society. People are staring, he murmured as she guided him through the basic waltz steps. Let them, Penelope replied, her eyes never leaving his face. Most of them have never had an original thought or authentic feeling in their lives. They just follow whatever path was laid before them. And you don't. A smile touched her lips. I'm dancing with a cowboy at the governor's reception while the son of my father's business partner fumes in the corner. What do you think? Despite his discomfort with their surroundings, Harlan found himself smiling in return. I think you enjoy challenging expectations. I enjoy authenticity, she corrected. Something I found in abundance during 4 days in a trapper's cabin. As they continued to dance, Harlan gradually relaxed into the movement, his natural grace compensating for his lack of formal training. The music swelled around them, and for a moment, the watching eyes and social barriers seemed to fade, until Governor Caldwell's authoritative voice cut through their reverie. Penelope, a word. They turned to find the governor standing at the edge of the dance floor, his expression carefully controlled but his eyes cold. Beside him, Richard Thornton watched with poorly concealed satisfaction. Penelope's hand tightened briefly on Harlan's shoulder before she stepped back. Of course, father. To Harlan, she added quietly, wait for me in the conservatory. Please. As she departed with her father, Harlan found himself suddenly alone in the center of the ballroom, acutely aware of the curious and judgmental gazes surrounding him. With as much dignity as he could muster, he made his way toward the glass doors leading to the conservatory, where he'd first met Penelope upon his arrival in Helena. The heated garden space was empty, its exotic plants creating shadows in the dimmer lighting. Harlan moved among them, wondering what madness had brought him here. A simple rancher presuming to step into the governor's world, to dance with his daughter, to imagine any outcome but humiliation. She's quite the accomplished manipulator, isn't she? Harlan turned to find Richard Thornton entering the conservatory, a glass of brandy in his manicured hand. I don't know what you mean, Harlan replied coldly. Thornton laughed, the sound entirely without humor. Come now, O'Connor. Surely you don't believe a woman of Penelope's station and breeding has any serious interest in a. What is it you do again? Rope cattle. I break horses, Harlan said evenly. And Miss Caldwell makes her own decisions. How charmingly naive. Thornton swirled his brandy. Penelope has always had a flair for the dramatic. A rebellious streak her father has indulged far too long. He stepped closer. She's using you to provoke him, nothing more. A momentary distraction before she assumes her proper place. Harlan's hands clenched at his sides. And I suppose you know what that proper place is. Everyone knows. Thornton replied with absolute certainty. Our families have planned this alliance for years. The governor simply wanted her to experience a little independence before settling into her responsibilities. This little, frontier adventure with you is just the last gasp of that phase. The word struck uncomfortably close to doubts Harlan had harbored since receiving Penelope's letter. If you're so confident, why bother telling me this? Thornton's smile thinned. Because I respect efficiency, O'Connor. The sooner you recognize the impossibility of your situation, the sooner Penelope will stop this tedious rebellion. He placed his empty glass on a nearby table. A man should know his place in the world. Yours is not here. Before Harlan could respond, the conservatory door opened again, and Penelope entered. Her face was flushed, her composure visibly strained, but her eyes flashed with determination. Richard, she said coldly upon seeing Thornton. I believe my father is looking for you now. Thornton's expression shifted instantly to polite concern. Are you all right, my dear? You seem upset. I'm perfectly fine, she replied. And not your dear. Please leave us. For a moment, it seemed Thornton might refuse, but after a calculating look between Penelope and Harlan, he offered a stiff bow. As you wish. We'll continue our discussion of the summer house plans tomorrow. After he departed, Penelope closed the door firmly behind him. Whatever he told you, disregard it, she said without preamble. Richard Thornton has been trying to secure my hand since I was 18, with my father's unfortunate encouragement. Is that what your father wanted to discuss? Harlan asked quietly. Penelope's shoulders sagged slightly. In part, he believes I'm making a spectacle of myself and compromising his political position. She moved to stand before Harlan, her eyes searching his face. He doesn't understand that meeting you changed something fundamental for me. Penelope, Harlan began, the weight of Thornton's words and his own doubts pressing down. Your father may be right. We come from different worlds. What happened in that cabin was extraordinary circumstances. Is that what you believe? She challenged. That what we shared was merely circumstance rather than genuine connection. That who I am in society is more real than who I was with you. I believe, Harlan said carefully, that a governor's daughter has responsibilities and expectations I know nothing about, and that frontier infatuations rarely survive once regular life resumes. Pain flashed across Penelope's face. Infatuation? Is that what you think this is? Before he could answer, the conservatory door opened again, and Governor Caldwell entered, his expression thunderous. Enough of this, Penelope, he said sharply. Your behavior tonight has been entirely inappropriate. The ambassador is waiting, and you have responsibilities as the hostess of this gathering. Father, Penelope began. Not now. The governor cut her off. Mr. O'Connor, while I appreciate your service to my daughter during her misfortune, I think it's best if you depart now. This is, after all, an official territorial function. The dismissal could not have been clearer. Harlan looked to Penelope, whose face reflected a conflict between ingrained obedience and newfound defiance. I should go, Harlan said quietly. No. Penelope replied, her voice strengthening. Father, Mr. O'Connor is my invited guest, and he will stay as long as he wishes. The governor's face darkened. Penelope, you are making a scene that will be gossiped about from here to Washington. Richard is already managing damage with the senator's wife. This infatuation with your rescuer has gone far enough. It is not an infatuation, Penelope said, her voice steady despite the color rising in her cheeks. And I am not a child to be managed or a political asset to be deployed. You are my daughter, Caldwell countered, and you have responsibilities to this family and my position. I have responsibilities to my own heart as well, she replied, moving to stand beside Harlan. Something I discovered while nearly freezing to death in the mountains. The governor turned his attention to Harlan. Mr. O'Connor, surely you understand that Penelope's gratitude for your rescue. while natural, has perhaps been misinterpreted as something more significant. The words echoed Thornton so closely that Harlan felt a flash of anger. With respect, Governor, I don't believe Miss Caldwell misinterprets her own feelings. Young man, Caldwell said, his voice hardening. You are placing my daughter in an impossible position. Whatever fantasy she has constructed around your wilderness adventure cannot survive the realities of her station. If you truly care for her welfare, you will remove yourself from this situation. The statement struck at Harlan's deepest doubts, that his presence in Penelope's life could only bring her difficulty and eventual disappointment. That loving her, if he dared name the feeling growing in him, meant letting her go. Father, stop this immediately, Penelope said, her voice shaking with emotion. You have no right to. It's all right, Harlan interrupted gently. The governor is right about one thing. You have responsibilities here tonight. He met her eyes, trying to convey what he couldn't say before her father. And I need to think about some things. Disappointment and hurt flashed across Penelope's face. Harlan, please don't. I'll call on you tomorrow, he promised quietly. To the governor, he added with deliberate formality. Thank you for your hospitality, sir. I'll see myself out. As he walked away, Harlan heard Penelope's heated words to her father fade behind him. The elegant ballroom seemed even more alien now as he made his way through the crowded gathering, a man suddenly aware he had stepped into waters too deep for his frontier experience. Outside in the bitter January night, Harlan stood for a long moment looking back at the blazing windows of the governor's mansion. For years, he had constructed a life that demanded nothing but what he could safely give: his labor, his skill with horses, his solitary endurance. Never his heart. Now, with painful clarity, he understood that meeting Penelope Caldwell had awakened something he'd spent years denying: the hunger for a connection that transcended mere survival. For a partner who saw him clearly and valued what she saw. But was such a connection possible across the divides of their worlds? Or was he merely prolonging an inevitable disappointment for both of them? With these questions weighing heavily, Harlan turned away from the governor's mansion and walked alone into Helena's winter streets, no closer to an answer than when he'd arrived. The next morning dawned cold and clear over Helena. Harlan rose early from his boarding house bed, his night having been largely sleepless as he wrestled with decisions that seemed to have no satisfactory resolution. After a sparse breakfast, he walked through town toward the Capitol building, where the legislative session would soon begin. He had no particular business there, but the walk gave purpose to his restless energy and direction to his scattered thoughts. Helena was transforming before his eyes, no longer a mining camp, but an emerging territorial capital with aspirations of statehood. New construction rose alongside the hasty structures of earlier boom years, banks and government offices declaring permanence where once only opportunity had ruled. It struck Harlan that he too stood at a juncture between what had been and what might be. The life he'd built, solitary, predictable, safely guarded against disappointment, suddenly seemed less like wisdom and more like fear. Fear dressed as practicality, loneliness disguised as independence. His wandering brought him to a small church on a side street, its doors open despite the early hour. Without conscious decision, Harlan found himself entering the quiet sanctuary, removing his hat as he slipped into a back pew. He wasn't a religious man in any formal sense. The frontier didn't encourage regular worship, and the God he'd occasionally addressed in moments of danger seemed distant from the rituals of Sunday services. Yet something about the still space invited reflection more honest than he'd permitted himself in years. Thinking deep thoughts this morning? The quiet voice startled him. An older man in clerical collar had approached without Harlan noticing, his weathered face suggesting he'd seen his share of frontier hardships. Just thinking, Harlan replied noncommittally. The minister nodded, making no move to press further or to leave. After a moment, Harlan found himself speaking again. Have you ever wanted something that seemed impossible? Not just difficult, but fundamentally out of reach. A slight smile touched the older man's face. Most things worth having seem impossible at first glance. He settled onto the pew beside Harlan. Is it a what or a who that seems beyond reach? Harlan gave a short laugh, surprised by the directness of the question. A who? A woman so far above my station, it's almost laughable. Oh. The minister nodded thoughtfully. And what makes her above you? Money? Education? Family? All of that, Harlan admitted. She's the governor's daughter. If the minister was surprised by this revelation, he didn't show it. I see. And does she consider herself above you? The question gave Harlan pause. No, he said slowly. She says she doesn't care about those differences. But you don't believe her? I believe she means it now, Harlan replied. But I've seen how the world works. Sooner or later, reality sets in. The governor's daughter and the ranch hand. It's a story that doesn't end well. The minister considered this. You know, young man, I came to Montana during the first gold rushes. Saw men who'd been nothing back east become wealthy overnight, while former gentlemen ended up digging ditches to survive. He gestured toward the window, where Helena's streets were coming to life. Out here, the old hierarchies don't hold as firmly as they once did. The territory is still writing its story, and so are the people in it. Her father doesn't see it that way, Harlan said grimly. Parents rarely do, the minister agreed. They see the world as it was when they learned its rules, not as it is becoming. He studied Harlan's face. But the real question isn't what her father believes, or even what you fear might happen. It's what you're willing to risk for something that matters. The word struck Harlan with unexpected force. Risk had always meant danger in his mind, something to be calculated and minimized. Yet here was another perspective. Risk as the necessary price of anything valuable. I should go, he said, rising abruptly. Thank you for the conversation, Reverend. I didn't offer any answers, the older man replied mildly. No, Harlan agreed, settling his hat back on his head. But you asked the right question. As he stepped back onto Helena's streets, Harlan felt a clarity that had eluded him through the long night. The fear of eventual disappointment, of not belonging in Penelope's world, these were real concerns. But for the first time in years, he recognized them as risks worth taking rather than warnings to be heeded. With renewed purpose, he turned toward the governor's mansion. Whatever came next, rejection or acceptance, struggle or joy, would at least be his choice rather than his surrender. At the governor's residence, Harlan found his way barred more firmly than before. The same guard who had admitted him yesterday now shook his head with undisguised satisfaction. Miss Caldwell isn't receiving visitors today, he stated flatly. Governor's orders. I need to speak with her, Harlan insisted. Just for a few minutes. She's not here anyway, the guard added. Left early this morning with Mr. Thornton and the governor for some legislative breakfast. His expression suggested he took personal pleasure in delivering this information. Best move along, Cowboy. Your entertainment value has worn thin. Frustration rising, Harlan considered his options. Forcing his way past would accomplish nothing but his own arrest. Creating a scene would only confirm the governor's worst assumptions about him. And yet leaving without seeing Penelope felt like abandoning the very purpose that had finally become clear to him. As he stood undecided, a servant emerged from a side entrance with a basket of laundry. The older woman glanced at Harlan, then at the guard, before continuing her work with deliberate slowness. Waste of time waiting here, she commented just loudly enough for Harlan to hear as she passed. Garden entrance will be unattended during the changing of the guard. 10 minutes. Before Harlan could respond, she had moved on, her face revealing nothing. The guard watched him expectantly, clearly hoping for an excuse to demonstrate his authority. I'll be back another time, Harlan said finally, touching the brim of his hat in grudging courtesy before walking away. 10 minutes later, as promised, Harlan found the garden entrance momentarily unwatched as guards changed positions. Slipping through the gate, he made his way toward the main house, uncertain of his next move but determined to find Penelope. The conservatory stood empty, its glass walls gleaming in the morning sunlight. As Harlan hesitated in its shelter, wondering where to look next, the door leading to the house opened and the servant with the laundry basket entered. Thought you might make use of the information, she said without preamble. Miss Penelope is in her rooms. 3rd floor, east wing. She refused to attend the breakfast with her father and that Thornton character. A hint of approval colored her voice. Caused quite a scene this morning, she did. Why are you helping me? Harlan asked. The woman's weathered face softened slightly. Been with the Caldwell family since Miss Penelope was born. Watched her grow up under the governor's thumb, always doing what was expected instead of what she wanted. She met Harlan's eyes directly. Until she came back from that storm with you. Never seen her stand up to him like she has since then. She pointed toward a service staircase. That'll take you up without passing the main halls. But if you're caught, I knew nothing about it. Harlan nodded his thanks, recognizing in the servant's quiet rebellion against authority a frontier spirit that transcended social position. Following her directions, he made his way cautiously through the mansion's service areas and up the narrow stairs used by household staff. The third floor was quieter than the levels below, with fewer signs of the official business that dominated the governor's residence. Moving carefully down the hallway of the east wing, Harlan paused outside a door where he heard movement within. After a moment's hesitation, he knocked softly. "I've already told you, Martha, I don't want breakfast," came Penelope's voice, edged with frustration. "It's not Martha," Harlan replied quietly. Silence followed, then rapid footsteps. The door opened to reveal Penelope in a simple morning dress, her chestnut hair loosely arranged as if she'd been interrupted while preparing for the day. Her blue eyes widened at the sight of him. "Harlan, how did you?" She glanced down the hallway. "Never mind that. Come in, quickly." She pulled him inside, closing the door behind him. Her private sitting room was elegantly appointed but less formal than the public spaces below, with books scattered across tables and a half-finished embroidery project set aside on a chair. "I thought you'd gone," Penelope said, her voice a mixture of relief and uncertainty. "After last night, when you left." "I needed to think," Harlan admitted. "About a lot of things." "And did you?" Her eyes searched his face. "Think about things?" Harlan nodded, suddenly finding the carefully considered speech he'd prepared inadequate for the moment. Instead, he reached for her hands, holding them gently in his. "I've spent years believing that the frontier only offers one choice: survive alone or don't survive at all," he said, the words emerging with unexpected ease. "It seemed safer that way. No expectations meant no disappointments." Penelope's fingers tightened around his. "And now I think maybe I was wrong," Harlan continued. "That there might be something worth risking disappointment for. Someone." Hope bloomed in her eyes, but she held herself carefully, as if fearing to assume too much. "My father will never approve. He has plans, alliances he's built around me." "I know," Harlan acknowledged. "And I can't offer you anything like what Thornton can. No wealth, no social position, no political advantages for your father." "I don't want those things," Penelope said firmly. "I want what I found in that cabin during the storm: honesty, courage, a man who sees me as a person rather than a governor's daughter." "It won't be easy," Harlan warned. "Your father has power in this territory, and people will talk." A smile touched her lips. "Let them talk. I've lived my entire life according to other people's expectations. Perhaps it's time I created some scandal worth gossiping about." The lightness in her voice belied the seriousness of what she proposed, defying her father, rejecting the path laid out for her, choosing a life with none of the certainties she had been raised to expect. "Are you sure?" Harlan asked, needing her to understand fully. "I can offer you my heart and my hands, but not much more than that." Penelope stepped closer, her blue eyes steady on his. "In that storm-bound cabin, with nothing but conversation to occupy us, I saw something I'd never found in all the drawing rooms and political gatherings of my life. A man of genuine character, unvarnished by pretense." Her hand rose to touch his face gently. "That's worth more than all my father's mansions and political connections." The certainty in her voice swept away Harlan's remaining doubts. Drawing her closer, he kissed her for the first time. A kiss that spoke of frontiers yet to be explored, challenges yet to be faced, but faced together rather than alone. When they parted, Penelope's eyes were bright with emotion and determination. "We need to leave Helena," she said decisively. "My father will use every means at his disposal to separate us if we stay." "Where would we go?" Harlan asked, though in truth he would have followed her anywhere. "West, to the Washington Territory perhaps," Penelope suggested. "Or north into Canada. Somewhere we can start fresh, without my father's shadow over us." The solution was both impulsive and impractical, exactly the sort of frontier decision that had built communities throughout the West. Yet Harlan found himself considering a more challenging path. "Running away would only confirm what your father believes about me," he said slowly. "That I'm not worthy of you, that I'd steal you away rather than facing him honorably." Penelope frowned slightly. "What are you suggesting?" "That we stay and fight for our place here," Harlan replied. Not just for us, but for the principle that in this territory, a person should be judged by their character rather than their birth or wealth. Surprise, and then admiration crossed Penelope's face. You would confront my father directly? Few men have the courage for that. I don't know if it's courage or foolishness, Harlan admitted. But I do know that the Montana Territory was built by people who refused to accept that their futures were determined by the past. If I'm going to love the governor's daughter, I should at least have the backbone to tell him so to his face. Penelope's expression softened into something that made Harlan's heart constrict with its tenderness. Love, she echoed. Harlan realized what he had said and found, to his surprise, that he meant it entirely. Yes, he said simply. I love you, Penelope Caldwell, against all common sense and frontier wisdom. Her answering smile was radiant. Common sense is highly overrated, she declared, standing on tiptoe to kiss him again. And I love you too, Harlan O'Connor, cowboy, rescuer, and the most honorable man I've ever known. The path ahead would be difficult. The governor's opposition, society's judgment, the practical challenges of bridging their different worlds. But standing in Penelope's sunlit sitting room, her hands warm in his, Harlan felt a certainty that had eluded him throughout his years of careful isolation. Some risks were worth taking, some connections worth fighting for. And sometimes, the most courageous act wasn't facing a blizzard alone, but opening one's heart to the possibility of both pain and joy. The confrontation with Governor Caldwell came sooner than either of them had anticipated. As Harlan and Penelope made their way downstairs, intending to wait for the governor's return in his study, they found him already home, engaged in heated discussion with Richard Thornton in the main hallway. Penelope, the governor exclaimed upon seeing them, his eyes widening with shock and then narrowing with fury at the sight of Harlan beside his daughter. What is the meaning of this? How did this man get into my house? I invited him, father. Penelope replied calmly, though Harlan could feel the tension in her hand as she gripped his. We have something to discuss with you. Richard Thornton's face darkened with understanding. Governor, I believe your daughter has been unduly influenced by this individual. Perhaps we should summon the guard. That won't be necessary, Harlan said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. I'm not here to cause trouble, just to speak plainly. Plainly, the governor repeated incredulously. You sneak into my home, corrupt my daughter with frontier romanticism, and expect me to listen to you speak plainly. Yes, sir, Harlan replied, meeting the older man's gaze directly. Because that's how men should address each other, regardless of their station. Something in his tone, not defiance, but simple dignity, caused the governor to pause. After a moment, he gestured sharply toward his study door. Very well, Mr. O'Connor. Let us speak plainly, man to man. To Thornton, he added, Richard, wait in the parlor. This won't take long. Father, I'm coming too, Penelope insisted. This concerns me as much as either of you. The governor looked as if he might refuse, but after a moment's consideration, he nodded curtly. Very well. Perhaps it's time you heard exactly why this. Infatuation is impossible. The study was an imposing room lined with leather-bound books and dominated by a massive desk that reinforced the authority of the man who sat behind it. Governor Caldwell took his seat there now, deliberately heightening the formal nature of their confrontation. Speak your piece, Mr. O'Connor, he said coldly. Though I warn you, nothing you say will change the fundamental realities of this situation. Harlan remained standing, Penelope beside him, her presence giving him strength he wouldn't have found alone. Governor Caldwell, he began. I came to Montana 5 years ago with nothing but my hands and a willingness to work. In that time, I've never asked for anything I didn't earn through my own efforts. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Until now. And what exactly are you asking for? The governor demanded. Your daughter's hand in marriage, Harlan stated simply. With your blessing, if possible. Without it, if necessary. The governor's face flushed with anger. This is absurd. You're a ranch hand, a drifter who happened to be in the right place during a storm. Whatever gratitude my daughter feels has clearly clouded her judgment. It isn't gratitude, father, Penelope interjected firmly. It's love, something you seem to have forgotten exists outside of political alliances and business arrangements. Love. The governor's laugh was harsh. What do either of you know about love? Real love isn't some romantic fantasy. It's building a life together providing security, creating a legacy. He turned his attention back to Harlan. What can you offer my daughter, Mr. O'Connor? A bunkhouse at some remote ranch. Endless winters with none of the comforts she's known all her life. Children raised without education or opportunity. The question struck at Harlan's deepest insecurities, the same doubts that had nearly prevented him from coming here today. Yet facing them directly, he found they held less power than he'd feared. I can offer her honesty, he replied steadily. Respect. Partnership rather than ownership. And yes, love. Not as some fantasy, but as a choice I make every day to put her happiness and welfare above my own. Pretty words, the governor dismissed. But words don't build houses or feed families. No, sir, they don't, Harlan agreed. But these hands do. He held them out, calloused, strong, marked by years of frontier work. I've never failed to earn my way. With time and honest work, I can provide a decent home, not a mansion, but a place of our own. A place of your own, the governor repeated derisively. Do you have any idea what Penelope's life has been? The education she's received? The future that awaits her? He turned to his daughter. You were raised for better things than becoming some cowboy's wife, isolated on the frontier while he chases cattle across the territory. Better things, Penelope challenged. Like marrying Richard Thornton for his father's business connections? Hosting political gatherings for the rest of my life while pretending to have no thoughts of my own. Her voice softened slightly. Father, I know you believe you want what's best for me, but you've never asked what I want. Because young women rarely know what's truly best for their futures, the governor replied, his tone softening slightly despite his words. Penelope, I've worked all my life to give you opportunities one never had. To see you throw them away on a momentary infatuation, it's not momentary, she interrupted. And I'm not throwing anything away. I'm choosing a different kind of opportunity, the chance to build a life with someone who values me for myself, not for what my name or connections can provide. The governor's expression hardened again. Mr. O'Connor may believe that now, but when the romantic glow fades and harsh reality sets in, he'll resent the sacrifices you represent. The doors that remain closed to him despite having the governor's daughter as his wife. You don't know me, sir, Harlan said quietly. So I understand why you'd think that. But I've never looked for open doors or easy paths. All I'm asking for is a chance to prove myself worthy of your daughter through actions rather than words. Something in Harlan's tone, the simple dignity of a man accustomed to being judged by his work rather than his background, seemed to reach the governor. For the first time since their confrontation began, he truly looked at Harlan, seeing beyond the rough exterior to the character beneath. And if I refuse, he asked finally, if I withhold my blessing and use every influence I possess to prevent this match. Penelope stepped forward, taking Harlan's hand firmly in hers. Then you would lose a daughter, father, because I will choose Harlan, with or without your approval. The declaration hung in the air, its finality undeniable. Governor Caldwell studied his daughter's face, seeing in it not the willful rebellion he had dismissed but the determined conviction of a woman who knew her own mind. After what seemed an eternity, he sighed deeply. You are so like your mother, he said, unexpected emotion roughening his voice. She had the same stubborn certainty when she chose me, against her family's wishes. The revelation startled both Harlan and Penelope. What do you mean? Penelope asked. The governor rose from behind his desk, moving to the window that overlooked Helena's growing streets. Before I was Governor Caldwell, I was Edward Caldwell, a young lieutenant with nothing but ambition to recommend me. Your grandfather was a senator who considered me entirely unsuitable for his only daughter. A ghost of a smile touched his face. Catherine disagreed, quite vocally. We eloped to avoid her father's interference. He turned back to face them, his expression softened by memory. Her father disowned her. It was years before they reconciled. Not until you were born, in fact. His eyes met Penelope's. I had hoped to spare you that kind of struggle. By choosing my husband for me? Penelope asked gently. By ensuring you married someone who could provide the life you deserve, her father corrected. The life your mother and I worked so hard to give you. Father, Penelope said, moving to take his hands. The greatest gift mother gave me wasn't social position or political connections. It was her example of courage, of choosing love even when it wasn't the easy path. She glanced back at Harlan. I'm not asking for your interference. I'm asking for your understanding, your trust in my judgment, as a woman rather than a child. The governor looked from his daughter to Harlan, his expression conflicted. You truly love her? He asked directly. Yes, sir, Harlan replied without hesitation. Enough to stand here facing your disapproval, which I assure you is more daunting than any blizzard. A reluctant smile tugged at the governor's mouth. At least you have courage, Mr. O'Connor. I'll grant you that. He sighed deeply. I cannot give my blessing to this match, not yet. But neither will I stand in your way, if this is truly what you both want. It wasn't approval, but it was more than either of them had dared hope for. Penelope embraced her father tightly. Thank you, she whispered. This means more than you know. Don't thank me yet, he warned, though his arms closed around her with unmistakable affection. Richard will not take this gracefully, and there will be social consequences you haven't anticipated. We'll face them together, Penelope said, reaching back for Harlan's hand without releasing her father. As Harlan joined them, the governor fixed him with a penetrating stare. If you ever hurt her, or fail to provide for her as she deserves, there is nowhere in this territory you could hide from me. Am I understood? Perfectly, sir, Harlan replied, meeting his gaze steadily. Though your threat is unnecessary. I'd sooner cut off my own hand than cause her pain. Governor Caldwell nodded once, a gesture of wary acceptance rather than wholehearted approval. Very well. We will speak more of practical matters tomorrow. For now, I believe I have an unpleasant conversation awaiting me with Richard and his father. As they left the study, Penelope squeezed Harlan's hand tightly. That went better than I expected, she whispered. Your father is a formidable man, Harlan observed. But he loves you. That's something I understand completely. The road ahead would not be easy. Society would gossip, Richard Thornton would nurse his wounded pride, and the governor's tentative acceptance would be tested repeatedly as they forged their unlikely union. Yet as they walked together through the mansion that had once seemed an insurmountable barrier between their worlds, Harlan felt a certainty that transcended all practical concerns. Some storms brought destruction, but others, like the blizzard that had stranded them together, cleared away the debris of false assumptions and revealed truths that might otherwise have remained hidden, including the truth that love, like the frontier itself, required courage, perseverance, and faith in possibilities yet unseen. Montana Territory, 1880. The small ranch house nestled against the foothills caught the golden light of late afternoon, smoke rising gently from its chimney. Two figures moved about the adjacent corral, their voices carrying clearly in the crisp autumn air. A tall man working with a spirited young horse, and a woman whose chestnut hair was gathered loosely at the nape of her neck as she observed from the fence. He's coming along nicely, Penelope O'Connor called as Harlan guided the colt through its paces. Much calmer than yesterday. He's figuring out that cooperation works better than fighting, Harlan replied with a smile. Most creatures do, eventually. Even stubborn ranchers and governors' daughters. Penelope asked, her blue eyes twinkling. Especially those, Harlan agreed, bringing the horse to a gentle stop and patting its neck approvingly. Though some take longer than others. 2 years had passed since the storm that had brought them together. 2 years of challenges overcome, expectations defied, and a life built not on what others thought possible, but on what they knew to be true. Their wedding had been small but dignified, held in the same church where Harlan had sought clarity before confronting the governor. Richard Thornton had left the territory in wounded pride, his father's business connections with Governor Caldwell surviving despite the personal disappointment. And while certain society matrons had predicted Penelope's swift disillusionment with frontier life, she had instead flourished away from Helena's constraints. The Sunrise Ranch, as they had named their modest holding, had begun with 80 acres Harlan had saved to purchase and expanded through his growing reputation as the finest horse trainer in the region. Penelope's unexpected talent for accounts and correspondence had transformed their operation from subsistence to genuine prosperity, modest by the governor's standards, but substantial by the measure of independent ranchers. Governor Caldwell had visited only twice, first for their wedding, his stiff formality gradually warming as he witnessed his daughter's evident happiness, and again 6 months ago, when political business had brought him to their region. On that second visit, observing the home they had built and the life they had forged together, He had finally offered his unqualified blessing, admitting with surprising humility that he had underestimated both Harlan's capabilities and Penelope's wisdom in choosing him. Now, as Harlan released the young horse into the larger paddock and climbed over the fence to join his wife, the satisfaction of their shared accomplishment settled around them like the golden light of approaching sunset. "Father's letter arrived today," Penelope said as they walked arm in arm toward the house. "He won't be seeking another term as governor. He's considering returning east next year. Will you miss having him in the territory?" Harlan asked, knowing how complicated her relationship with her father remained despite their reconciliation. Penelope considered the question thoughtfully. "Parts of him, yes. But we've found our peace with each other, and he's finally accepted that my happiness doesn't depend on following the path he envisioned." As they reached the porch of their home, modest compared to the governor's mansion, but solid and welcoming with its riverstone fireplace and handcrafted furniture, Penelope paused, her hand resting gently on her slightly rounded abdomen. "Besides," she added with a soft smile, "we'll be rather occupied ourselves come spring." Joy and wonder crossed Harlan's face as he placed his hand over hers. The news was still new between them, a private miracle they were only beginning to fully comprehend. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly, the question he had stopped asking months ago, but which sometimes still whispered in the back of his mind. "Choosing this life instead of the one your father planned." Penelope's answer was to draw him close, her blue eyes holding his with the same clarity and conviction that had sustained them through every challenge. "Never," she said simply, "not for a single moment. Because this life, our life, is real in a way nothing in Helena ever was. We built it together, with our own hands and hearts." As the setting sun painted the Montana sky in shades of gold and crimson, Harlan O'Connor gathered his wife into his arms, marveling still at the storm that had led a solitary cowboy and a governor's daughter to find in each other not just rescue from freezing, but warmth that would last a lifetime. The frontier had taught him to expect hardship, to guard against attachment, to survive alone rather than risk disappointment. But Penelope had taught him something far more valuable, that survival alone was never enough, that the truest courage lay in opening one's heart despite the risk, and that love, like the territory itself, grew stronger through every storm it weathered. "Come inside," Penelope said, taking his hand and leading him toward the doorway. "The wind's picking up, and I believe there might be snow before morning." Harlan smiled, following willingly. Whatever storms came, they would face them together, no longer a cowboy and a governor's daughter, but partners in the finest sense of the word, building a life that transcended the boundaries others had tried to place around them. And in that, they had found the true promise of the frontier, not merely survival against the elements, but the freedom to forge connections that defied expectation and transformed isolation into belonging.